So we have discussed power a little bit throughout our classes, but this chapter really is going to dive into power, the certain types of powers that we have, the influence that we have on others, aspects such as organizational politics. Why is networking important, and how are we going to how can you negotiate? What is the best methods of negotiating? So this is really going to cover a bit of each of this. So as we talked about in class, power is a fundamental concept in social science, and power skills, they can be taught and developed. Normally, power is not something that somebody is born with, right? Really, it depends on your traits and your behavior, but power is something that really can define somebody, right? I'm sure everyone is familiar with the term, if you want to really find out who someone is, give them a great amount of power, right? Because normally the way that we use power will determine who we really are as individuals, right? So what is power? Although people naturally think it has a negative connotation to it, in reality, it's really a neutral term. It really depends on the person and what they do with that power. So for instance, somebody like Martin Luther King, he had a great amount of power, right? Although he did not have any type of position power per se in our government, he respectively changed our government. He changed the way society viewed things, right? Through empowering others. So therefore, he is somebody who to this day is still renowned, right? Versus somebody like, I don't know, Adolf Hitler. He used his power in a negative way, right? And that really led to the destruction and the destruction and hurt of millions of lives. So what is power? Power is about achieving influence over others. Power is really the leader's potential to influence their followers. This is the reason why it's so important. Although we think that power is something that's only dedicated to a certain few, in reality, that's not true. We all have power within us, right? The idea here is that you are continuously influencing people, whether you realize it or not. So for instance, last week I gave the example about the lady who shoplifted from Walmart. Now, although she did this entirely on her own, she really wasn't focusing on who was watching her. There were people who were watching her, and indirectly she influenced people. My wife and I were influenced because we never saw anybody really shoplift like that. And seeing the lack of action amongst security and I guess, what would you call her, the greeter, really shows that maybe Walmart is a place that really does not focus too much on shoplifting. Maybe this is an area that they should focus more on, right? But the whole idea here is that indirectly her actions influenced many people. It may have been something traumatizing to either the security or the greeter. So these are things to consider. Because power is the potential to influence, you do not actually have to really use that power. It's the idea of the perspective of the power, right? So for instance, think of like your superior, think of maybe like your manager. Your manager has the power to fire you, but that does not mean that they're going to fire you. They don't always have to use their power to show that they have power, right? A lot of us show up to work and show up on time because we do not want to be fired, right? We have the perception, the perspective that our manager has the ability to fire us. So therefore, we choose to show up on time because we do not want to be fired, if that makes sense. So there's really 7 types of power. Actually, I'm sorry, there's one thing that I did forget to talk about. Would be the aspect of position power and personal power. When we talk about position power, this is derived from top management, right? It's something that has been delegated down the chain of command. So it's a position of status that gives you power. So for instance, your manager having the ability to fire you if you are late. That is a power that's been given and bestowed upon them, right? Although people often, as I mentioned, view power in a negative way, within an organization, it should be seen in a positive light. When we talk about personal power, this is derived from the followers based it's derived from the followers, right? And it's based on the viewers, on the, sorry, on the leader's behavior. So here, a charismatic person can have personal power. Normally, somebody who has personal power, they're seen as leaders. They're designated that position by their peers. So in other words, their peers view them as leaders. So for instance, you not only have to be charismatic, maybe you are empowering. Maybe you are very knowledgeable. Maybe you're very encouraging. Maybe you're very supportive. Maybe you are very, let me see, what would be another good term? Maybe you're very, as I mentioned, knowledgeable. Maybe you've been at the organization for a long time. Maybe you're willing to help people. Maybe you're more participative. These are all factors that can lead to peers viewing you as a person of power, right? They view you as a leader. So although you may not be given any actual legitimate power, this still is power within itself. Why? Because you are still influencing people, because really that is the summation of power. Power is the ability to influence. So in the 1950s, French and Raven, they distinguished 5 types of power, which is reward, coercive, legitimate, expert, and reverent power. But 2 more powers were added in here. So hence the 7 types of power. So when we talk about legitimate power, this is based on a user's position power, and it's given by the organization. There is something that normally when we talk, we're going to talk about not only the powers, but also influencing tactics and how they can be useful. So let's see, somebody who has given legitimate power would be somebody like, I don't know, a coach, maybe your teacher. This is somebody who's given power, right? So therefore, that power has been bestowed upon them. How can you use this power? So for instance, like a coach decides who's going to play, who's going to be on the bench, how long they're going to play. Teachers are the ones that decide the grades, right? I mean, although it is supposed to be completely objective, in reality, they're the ones that dictate whether somebody will get an A or somebody will get a B. So these are ways the legitimate power is used, okay? When we talk about reward power, this is really is based on the user's ability to influence others with something of value to them. So in a management position, you can use reward power as a positive reinforcement, right? You can use things such as incentives, like praise, recognition, maybe pay raises, bonuses, promotions. These are aspects that you can use. Normally, you'll find that legitimate and reward power, they correlate with one another, right? Because the idea here is that if you have legitimate power, then you have the ability to be able to provide rewards. So in other words, a manager may have more reward power than somebody who solely has personal power, right? Because they are able to maybe give those pay raises, etc. But please do not confuse that we all, that reward power is something that anybody can have, right? So for instance, let's say that you work as a server and you really need your shift to be covered and nobody wants to cover it. Maybe it's like a bad day that everybody knows that they don't make too much money on that day, right? So let's say that you go up to Brittany and you say, hey, Brittany, I really need you to cover my shift. I know you have the day off. And Brittany says, no, that day really doesn't pay. I'm sorry, right? So you may say, well, Brittany, if you cover my shift, I'll not only, you get to work, make a little extra money, but I'll also, give you $100 on top of that. So indirectly, it's a reward to Brittany for her working. So that would be a way of using reward power, right? But once again, normally people with legitimate power are the ones that use reward power because they have more resources and ability to do so, right? One other thing that I would like to mention when we talk about reward power is that a leader's power in regards to this is strong or weak based on their ability to reward the followers, right? So if they don't have the ability, let's say that you are a manager, but a manager with limited privileges, then it's really not that great of a position, right? Because you cannot create incentives. An important part of reward power is also having control over getting and allocating resources, as I mentioned. The more scarce something is, the more desirable it will be. So for instance, one of my classes, I had a student mention that they, as a manager, one of the ways that they provided incentives for their team was they would give away Disney packages, right? So it not only included the all expense pass to Disneyland, but they also got like the fast pass and some other things, right? So this is something scarce. Why is it scarce? Because of the fact that not it's pretty expensive. So normally people, they don't go all the time like that, right? I mean, some people, I'm not quite sure if Disney, I know that Disney took away all of the memberships. I'm not quite sure if they're providing new memberships or exactly what's going on there. But the whole idea here is that normally, you have to allocate that kind of money, right? To be able to do the fast pass, to be able to do both parks, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So if you have something that's all inclusive like that, it becomes something, very enticing because of the fact that it's scarce, because you can't just say, hey, oh, I'm going to go to Disney, I'm going to do this, right? Because most people have to look at their budget. So when we talk about coercive power, this involves punishment and withholding of rewards to influence compliance. So for instance, when we use coercive power, fears of things like reprimanding, probation, being given suspension, dismissal. These are ways that you can use coercive power, right? Where people perceive this. We talked about this last class, right? A lot of times these can be avoidance reinforcements. So for instance, if you tell someone, hey, Bob, you need to start coming in because I don't want to have to write you up. That within itself is encouraging Bob, hey, I better step back, back in line, because if not, I'm going to lose my job. In addition, punishment. So if we want to take this like withholding rewards, another example would be if Bob was late all the time, he said, Bob, you've been late, so I'm going to take a day away from you. So now instead of you working 5 days a week, you're only going to work 4. So this is an example also of using coercive power. Although coercive power may seem enticing to get people to do something that a superior requests, it's important to realize that this is something that you should not use all the time, right? It should be the last resort. Why? Because when you are continuously punishing people, even for the smallest infraction, really what happens is there creates some resentment amongst your team, right? And as we've talked about throughout this class, it's really important that a leader and a follower have a relationship with one another. And I'm not talking about a social relationship, but one that's based on trust and respect. Right. And if you're continuously punishing somebody, even if especially for something extremely insignificant, the chances of them becoming disengaged from their overall objective is going to be higher, right? There's going to be resentment there. They may not take your words of wisdom into consideration. They may, strain away from the organization. They may no longer feel committed because of the fact that they feel that they harbor these feelings, right? So this is the reason why coercive power should not be used rashly. It's something that should be really taken into consideration. When we talk about referent power, this is based on the user's personal relationship with others. Here, power stems primarily from relationships with the person using power. So charismatic leaders tend to use referent power, right? Here, somebody who's inspirational can have this type of power, right? There's somebody who has a good relationship with others, who's able to be more sociable, somebody who's able to control this, or not control, but to use this type of power to their benefit, right? So once again, somebody who has referent power, that's really based on their ability to approach others, their ability to connect with others. There is an influencing tactic, but we're going to talk all about that in the next, in the next slide. Just trying to move this box, but it's trying to move the whole thing. No, sorry. Okay. So when we talk about expert power, this is based on a user's skill and knowledge. Being an expert makes other people depend on you, right? People they often respect somebody who is an expert, somebody who's knowledgeable. So this is something that is important. So for instance, say somebody who's been in an organization for 10 years, they may be somebody who has expert power because they have quite a bit of knowledge that they require throughout the organization. So if you were new in an organization, you may go to that person for help, right? So would be somebody demonstrating their expert power. The more people come to you for advice, the greater your expert power. Experts, there's somebody, as I mentioned, who is knowledgeable, somebody who is respected amongst their peers. Let me see. Yeah, I think that's about it for that one. When we talk about information power, this is based on the user's data desired by others. So when we talk about information power, this involves access to vital information and knowledge and control over its distribution to others. So in other words, the idea here is that the more scarce this information is, the more valuable it is, right? So for instance, let's say that you are going to do a reduction in your organization of staff, right? So the managers would have information about this. They're the ones that have to probably, decide who they're going to get rid of. So therefore, they have a great amount of information power. Why is it that only seldom people know? Because of the fact that maybe they don't want to cause panic amongst the rest of the group, right? A lot of the times you'll find that information is trickled down, right? So in other words, it may begin at the top and make its way down to the bottom. So in other words, regular employees are the last people to know. So if you have some vital information and knowledge that others do not have, the stronger your information power is. And when we talk about connection power, this is based on the user's relationship with influential people. Connection power, the more the right connections can give you power, or at least can give you the perception of having power, right? This is where networking would come in. So influencing tactics to consider. The reason why we are going in so much depth in this is because of the fact that this is going to be useful for your essay question. I highly, highly, highly consider for you to study pages 147 to, I think, 150. Those are going to be very useful for your essay. So the 7 power slide and this slide and the next slide are going to be very, very useful as well. So I highly suggest that you take a look at these, make note of them for your overall essay. Because as I mentioned, guys, it's worth 15 points. And because I'm giving you so much time, I really do expect you to give me a good essay, okay? So just to go over these influencing tactics, when we talk about legitimate power, one influencing tactic that may be used is the legitimization influencing tactic. So what is this? This is when employees or maybe followers feel that they have an obligation to do what is needed, right? Because their manager, because it's the scope of the job. So in other words, a lot of the times you'll find that this is a way that people often function within a toxic environment. They will say, well, this person is the leader, so I guess they know what they're talking about. So it's my job to follow them. So I will do what's needed, okay? So for instance, let's say that you are on a soccer team, and let's say that your coach takes you out. Although you think you've been doing a great job, they take you out. Now, although you may disagree with it, you probably were more likely to sit down because of the fact that in your mind, you're already thinking, well, this person is, they have legitimate power. They're the coach, so therefore I have to listen. Okay, so that would be the legitimization influencing tactic. Why are influencing tactics important? Because these are good ways for you to using these tactics are a good way to explore and increase that type of power, right? So it's important. This is the reason why it's important to be aware of them, because given the scenario, you would have to decide which influencing tactic may be useful. Because as we talked about in class, a lot of times it's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? So it's important that you are able to influence people in the best way possible. Although I know that often feels like manipulation. Really, it's not. It's the idea here is that you're finding the right way to influence them so that way they can consider your position and the legitimacy of that position, right? So when we talk about other aspects of legitimate power that may be useful, would be something like rational persuasion. So rational persuasion includes logical arguments with factual evidence to persuade others. So like, let's say that you don't have legitimate power. Let's say that you're just an ordinary Joe, but you're trying to get somebody who has legitimate power to consider your proposition. Maybe you're trying to, I don't know, maybe you're trying to renew some type of procedure. Maybe you're trying to change some structure within your organization. By using rational persuasion, this may be a good way to convince them, right? So rational persuasion, this is when you are dealing with really critical thinking. You're dealing with logical arguments, statistics, valid information, right? Why is this so effective? This is actually one of the most effective influencing tactics because it's really hard to argue with data, right? With valid data. So in other words, it's say that you have a situation. I think one of the example that I gave you for one of the questions that I've asked in the past, it's something to the extent that you are a production manager and your production team is behind, right, in an organization. The sales manager and their sales team are making more sales than you can keep up with. So you've decided to take the sales manager to lunch. What would be a good tactic to use, right? So a rational persuasion influencing tactic would be a really good one. Why? Because here you can explain, you can show the data about how behind you are. Maybe you could show that everyone is working as fast as they can, or maybe you can show that how the numbers are differing between the amount of sales being made and the amount of production being made, right? By showing valid data and showing that this is the reason why you can't keep up with them, that you need them to either, limit their sales or work with you in some way. Ingratiation would be a good way to do that, right? I'm sorry, not ingratiation, rational persuasion would be a good way to do that. When we talk about ingratiation, this is really the way of being friendly and praising others before you ask them for what you want. So as I mentioned, a lot of it has not the way you ask. It's not about what you ask, it's the way you ask it. So in other words, if you are rude and you go up to the sales manager and you throw this data on the floor and say, hey, this is, you need to cut this out. I can't keep up with you, blah, blah, blah. Do you really think the sales manager is going to listen? Probably not, right? So maybe by being nice, telling them how much you appreciate their sales, explaining how this can really affect their overall organization, because what's the point of making sales if you can't keep up with production? If you make the sale and the delivery date is late, it only hurts the overall brand of the organization, right? So these could be aspects that you would want to include. But once again, you want to be friendly and praise them, tell them, show appreciation. Another example I like to mention for ingratiation is something like, to the extent, let's say that you need a letter of recommendation. A student may come up to me and say, I had you 2 years ago and I need a letter of recommendation. Will you write me one? I may be a little hesitant because, once again, there may be a number of students that I have taught. So therefore, it may be harder to recall their overall impact, right? Versus if the student said, I had you 2 years ago, I thought you're a wonderful professor. I think, I really enjoyed this topic. Leadership is something that truly interests me. I'm actually thinking of, getting my such and such degree so that way I can continue this route or what have you, I may be more inclined to write a letter of recommendation, right? Because of the fact that they're being so friendly. They've told me that they think I'm a good professor. Indirectly, they're praising me, really paying up to my emotions, right? So this is just an example to show how ingratiation can be helpful. You can do this as well with your superiors, your manager, or even a fellow peer if you need if you need help with something, if you need some type of collaboration with them. So that's something to consider as well. So as we talked about, reward power consists of your ability to influence others with something of value. So when we talk about the reward power, there is an influencing tactic that's good to use here, right? And that's the exchange influencing tactic. This is when you offer someone a type of reward for helping meet your objective. So for instance, we go back to the example given, right, that I mentioned, where you're looking for somebody to cover your shift. So you offer Brittany $100 to cover your shift. So indirectly then that is an exchange tactic, right? Brittany's going to work for you, and in exchange, she's going to get $100. This can be very useful, especially if it's something that they want. Now, if I only offered Brittany like a $5, she'd probably be like, no, I can get $5, off of just one customer, right? So that's an example, right? So because now she probably won't consider taking the shift because the reward offered is not something that is desirable versus $100, maybe that'll perk her ears up, right? When we talk about coercive power, as we mentioned, this involves punishment or withholding of rewards to influence compliance. As I mentioned, although this is something that may seem tempting, should be the last resort measure. So there is an influencing tactic in regards to this one. It's called the pressure influencing tactic. So really, this is where you're pressuring, where employees are feeling pressured from fear of reprimanding, fear of probation, fear of being dismissed, or what have you, right? So this is another way that toxic organizations, continue, right? Because of the fact that a lot of times people will not step out of line for fear of some type of repercussion, right? They are fearful that they're going to lose their job, so therefore they do not question the levels of authority. When we talk about information, this, as we talked about, is based on the user's data desired by others. So some aspects that you would want to include here would be rational persuasion and inspiration appeals. To increase information power, you want to make sure that you have information that flows through you, right? You want, as we talked about, rational persuasion includes logical arguments with factual evidence. So you may use this to your measure, right, to explain why it is that this information is coming to light. When we talk about expert power, this is somebody who this is a power that is based on a person's skill and knowledge. So what would be a good influencing tactic here? Rational persuasion would be a good one, right? Because of the fact that experts, the more information you have, the more advice you're able to offer, the more knowledgeable you are, the greater your expert power is. So therefore, if you're able to explain things rationally, right, with factual data to support your claim, well, then that only increases the power of expert power, right? So if we go back to the example about the production manager and the sales manager, production manager may use expert power because of the fact that they are an expert in production. They are a manager, right? They're very knowledgeable about that department. The sales manager may not be very knowledgeable about it. So by using rational persuasion and explaining to them, this is the reason why, maybe the reason why production has not been able to keep up is because there is a chink in the supply chain, right? That is something that's out of your hands and it's out of the sales hands. But by working together, you can solve this problem. And when we talk about referent power, this consists of power that's based on the user's personal relationship with others. So a good type of influencing tactic would be, let's see, the inspirational appeals influencing tactic, right? This is where you appeal to the followers' values, their ideals, and their aspirations to increase self-confidence. By displaying your feelings to appeal to followers, you're indirectly empowering them, right? Since rational persuasion uses logic, inspiration appeals to the emotion and to the enthusiasm. So for instance, somebody like Martin Luther King, he had reverent power, right? Because of the fact that he appealed to people's emotions. He empowered people. He empowered people to take a stand and make a change within society. And when we talk about the personal appeals influencing tactic, this is based on aspects such as loyalty and friendship. Here, power stems primarily from relationships with the person using the power. So for instance, you use personal appeals, this is where you're clinging to their loyalty and overall friendship. And lastly, connection power. As we talked about, this is based on a user's relationship with influential people. There is a tactic called the coalition influencing tactic. This may be useful, especially if you have two parties who are trying to achieve a certain objective, right? The more people that you can get on your side, the more influence you can have over others. So for instance, an example I like to use of a coalition influencing tactic would be something like Hollywood. A lot of the times you'll find that numerous organizations, numerous job titles will come together and merge together for the sake of a movie, right? So in other words, you'll have certain production teams working with one another, you'll have certain artists working with one another, certain, makeup artists, costume, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? They all are experts in their own field, but they come together and collaborate with one another for the sake of this given movie. Once the movie is over, they disperse, and you'll find that sometimes they may never work again together, or they may work again on another movie, right? It just really depends. But the idea here is coming together for the sake of that objective. So when we talk about the Solomon Asch experiment, this is not something you really need to know. This is intended just to show how we often succumb to pressure, right? The idea here is that although we are individuals, we also are inclined to social viewpoints, social perceptions, and social pressures, right? So this experiment really consists of, they had 8 participants, and there was only actually one true participant being studied, right? And the idea here was they were asking which line is similar to the given line, right? So you had to answer either A, B, or C. So although in the beginning it looks like the participant who's being studied is very secure about their answer, as they are seeing everyone else, so the other participants are giving the wrong answer, the same wrong answer. So this person looks very confused. When it comes to their turn, they end up going along with the wrong answer. Why is this? Well, the idea here is that we often succumb to the social pressures of others, right? What they actually found out here is that there's really 2 perspectives to consider. One is that the participant thinks that his knowledge is lacking, so therefore he thinks that the majority knows more. And secondary, he's afraid to go against social norms. The social norm stated here is that the wrong answer is a correct answer, right? So as I said, this is just an example to demonstrate how strong someone else's influence can play upon us. This is also like for example, another reason why people don't ask questions when a professor or a teacher asks a question, says, does anybody have any questions? More than likely, you're going to have, if nobody raises their hand, nobody's going to ask a question. Why? Because people are afraid of going against the social norm. So now when we talk about organizational politics, very much like power, politics usually has a negative connotation. Why is that? Because of the fact that we think that politics is something dirty and manipulative, right? But in reality, it depends on the person and how they are using it. So, what is politics? Politics is defined as a process of gaining and using power. And although we would like to think that everything is based on our merit, it's just unfortunately not so, right? The reality here is that think a superior is watching over, let's say, hundreds of people, maybe a great amount of people. The idea here is that all of these people may be very talented and they have their own strengths and their own weaknesses. But how is it that you can how can you make that leader see you and value your strengths, right? So the idea here is that anybody could do a job, really. But you need to be seen in order to be considered for that job, right? And this is the reason why organizational politics is so important. So like power, politics has a negative connotation because people normally they may abuse political power. But it really, as I mentioned, it depends on the person and it depends on their capability, right? It depends on their characteristics. If they use it for a good purpose, then it will be, very useful. But if they use it negatively, well, then we've seen the disastrous events of that. So there is something called the social exchange theory. This is the exchange between people as social as opposed to economic in nature, right? So like money, politics in and of itself is inherently neither good or bad. So, but politics is a system of getting things done, getting what it is that we want. So in our economy, we normally, what gets things done? Money, right? So with the social exchange theory, what gets things done? Your sociability, right? Your ability to connect and create bridges with one another, your networking capabilities. So when we talk about economic exchange versus organizational exchange, you'll find that money is normally the medium of exchange, right? It's a tangible currency. Versus in an organization, social politics is the medium of exchange, the political behavior, right? Aspects such as reciprocity, right? So for instance, let's say that let's just take that example again about Brittany and you needing somebody to take your shift. So maybe you ask Brittany and say, hey, I really need you to take my day. Can you cover me? And instead of Brittany saying no, maybe she says, okay, yeah, but you're gonna owe me. And you agree and say, okay. And then maybe, I don't know, around Christmas, or maybe on a holiday, she needs a day off. So now she asks you. So now you're more inclined to agree to taking over that day because she has extended you the courtesy of covering your day previously, right? So when we talk about political behavior, how well you play politics directly affects your overall success. So things that we need to consider are aspects such as networking, reciprocity, and coalitions. So when we talk about networking, this is a process of developing relationships for the purpose of socializing, right? Successful managers, they spend more time networking than average managers. Why is networking so important? As I told you, statistically, 70% of lucrative jobs are created through networking. The reason why it is so important that you make these connections and that you maintain these connections is because you never know when they're going to serve of any use, right? I know that sounds very bad, but in reality, like, look, let's say the groups that you are in, you really don't know if somebody who is in your group is going to, have their own organization, their own business, or maybe they're gonna, rise to a high position. Now you yourself maybe have enough potential or be equally potentialed as everyone else. But if you do not keep that what would be the word? If you do not keep that network of communication open, how can that person who is now a success consider you as a potential job candidate if you do not keep that road open, right? So that's the whole purpose of networking. Idea here is that there's a lot of people who are equally or they have the same strengths, right? They have, anybody can flourish in this position, but really the idea is they have to be seen to be able to take that job. It's almost like, if you think about it, like an actor job, right? A lot of times we may consider somebody in a position and be like, oh, that's the right person, but anybody really could be the right person. But who's given the opportunity, who's given the resource to be able to, go out for that part? When we talk about reciprocity, this involves creating obligations and developing alliances and using them to accomplish objectives. So, for instance, if we go back to the example that I gave you, Brittany has now covered your shift. So now you're going to do Brittany a favor and cover her shift when needed. So there you are. You're reciprocating a favor, right? This is in order to, by reciprocating favors, doing favors for others, this is really opening those network lines, right? Throwing out those fishing lines and keeping them active, because you never know when it's going to serve you of some purpose. So, for instance, if Brittany would not have covered your schedule, you probably would not have covered Brittany's. So that's the whole purpose of reciprocation. When we talk about coalitions, using coalitions as is important because this can help to achieve a specific objective. A lot of times you'll find that parties will come together for the sake of a given objective, right? There's something called co-optation, which is a process of getting a person whose support you need to join a coalition rather than to compete against them. So I'm sure everyone's ever heard that saying, my enemy's enemy is my friend, right? The idea here is that a lot of times working together can be more useful than competing with one another, especially if you have someone who is a more dire competition, right? So let's say, like, go back to the movie idea of Hollywood. Here you find that these coalitions exist all the time where parties come together and maybe the participants don't even really get along with each other, but they come together because their overall objective is to make a successful movie and reap the benefits of it, right? So therefore they come together for the job, which is the objective. Once the objective is achieved, they move on to their next job. So guidelines for developing political skills. Some things you should consider is you need to learn the organization culture, learn what type of culture this is, who are the power players. For instance, when we talk about learning the power players, it's not only knowing what position they are and what service they may be inclined to help you with, but it really also needs to know who they are, right? What type of person they are. So for instance, if you're trying to give a lot of praise to somebody who's not who's more of an introvert than an extrovert, that might not be a good thing. They may consider you to be more of a nag than anything, right? So you really need to understand what these power players, who they are, what they like, so that way you can appeal to them in the most effective method. When we talk about developing working relationships, you want to develop good working relationships, one that are based on not only you want good working relationships that are not only based on aspects such as respect, but you also want to be able to have a credible working relationship, right? You want your manager to see you as a credible and responsible person. So in other words, you want to have them see you in the best light possible. It's important that you are loyal and an honest team member. And lastly, you want to gain recognition. How do you gain recognition? By going out of your way, doing a little extra, right? To make sure that your manager sees you and your potential. And when we talk about networking, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the 1 minute self. Other names for it is like the 30-second commercial or the elevator pitch. The idea here is that you should be able to summarize your skills, your highlights, and your overall goals in 1 minute, right? You should have relatively a close script of this in the back of your mind for an instance that you may run into somebody who may serve may open a door of opportunity for you. So for instance, like the elevator speech, the idea here is that you may be caught in an elevator with a manager or someone of a higher position that you are highly sought after, right? So you may want to meet with that person, talk to them, and give them your 1 minute self, right? So what consists of that? The idea here is to have an opening statement where you're quickly summarizing yourself, summarize your career history, your education, what is your overall goals? Have you had any highlights in your career? Maybe you've been able to do something that not anyone else has. Maybe it's something that'll be highly effective to whatever it is that you're looking for. So for instance, let's say that you want a job in a sales team. You can talk about, and you did a great job in your previous job, right? As a sales marketing agent, right? Maybe you increase sales by 10%. That would be something that you would want to include, right? Because this highlights that you are an effective person. You would opt a question. You want to encourage a two-way communication. You would also want to have some research about that person. So let's say that maybe it's not a superior, maybe it's somebody, maybe it is a leader of an organization that you really want to work for. Talk about how much you enjoy them, how, maybe use a little bit of information about them. So that way there shows some type of engagement. But lastly, don't be afraid to ask them what it is that you're telling them what it is you're looking for. Maybe I'm really looking for an interview. I would really appreciate if you have any job openings that you reach out to me, etc. There is a saying that closed mouths do not get fed. The idea here is that if you do not say anything, then they will never get to know you. And the idea is for you to familiarize yourself with them. When we talk about negotiation, you're going to find that negotiation is something that is critical in any organization. You're going to find that you may not only have to negotiate within the organization, but outside of the organization. Conflict is everywhere, especially within an organization. We think that conflict is a negative term, but in reality, it can be a good term. Conflict leads to change, and sometimes change is necessary, right? But it is important that when you negotiate that you create a plan. Some things to consider would be not only to develop a plan, really make a pros and cons list. What are the things that you would be able to give up? What are the things that you cannot give up? You want to set objectives. What are you hoping to achieve with the negotiation? You want to do research on the opposing team, right? Research their needs, research their wants, research where you feel that they're lacking. So it may be an area of opportunity for you. You want to also develop options and trade-offs, so that way you can propose a plan to them, right? What will they be willing to sacrifice? What are you willing to sacrifice? What can you trade off with one another so you can meet a mutual ground? When we talk about negotiations, some factors to consider is you need to separate people from the problem. So in other words, your disagreement is a disagreement amongst for that specific negotiation, right? It's not really you as people, if that makes sense, right? So in other words, you should not take it personal. Don't let emotions get into the way, because then that can really cloud your overall judgment. You want to focus on interest, not position. So although you may say no and they may say no, instead of just saying, okay, well, then we can come to agreement, try to find a mutual interest, right? What is your overall mutual interest? What is going to benefit the both of you? Now, if you cannot come to an agreement, it is okay to postpone it. A lot of the times you'll find, especially in negotiations, that somebody may be using a more aggressive conflicting style, right? Where they're like bullies. Maybe they're more emotional. If you feel that your emotions are coming up and you're not able to restrict them, that it's clouding your judgment, postponing is a good thing. If both parties are upset and you just feel that you're not coming to some type of valuable trade-off, then maybe taking time off so that way you can both cool down and reconsider your positions may be the best thing. But if you cannot come to an agreement, then it's important to understand why it is you did not come to agreement. Try to replay it again, because you may have to go back into negotiations once again, because maybe this particular situation needs to be handled immediately, right? Or by evaluating this overall process and understanding why you were not able to meet an agreement. It's almost like going back and researching the way you played in a game, right? Um, I'm sure that if anybody who's been in a sport knows this, you know, coach may record the game and then later you look at it to see where your mistakes are. The idea here is that by evaluating it, you can only strengthen your overall skills. And lastly, when we talk about ethics and influencing, why is it so important that we use power well? As I talked about, because we are continuously influencing people, and somebody with more power usually has more of the capability of influencing more people. Because influence is fluid and malleable, it's neither good or bad. So it really depends on what you do. If you set a positive example for people, they're more inclined to take that positivity and use it for something good. Versus if you're doing unethical things, they're more likely to emulate that unethical behavior. It's kind of like we talked about in class, the fishbowl theory. The idea here is that you're continuously, as a leader, being monitored, whether you realize it or not. So not only does the action that you take, but your lack of action also says a lot for you too. So for instance, if we go back to the example about Walmart, it was not only about the lady that was shoplifting, it's also about the fact that neither the Walmart worker or the security really took an emphasis in this lady stealing. So it only encourages unethical behavior. That makes sense, right? Because their lack of action really says something to the audience who's watching, which is everyday shoppers like my wife and I. So this is the reason why it's so important that as a leader, you continuously remain ethical. Sometimes the hardest road is always the best road, right? Being ethical is not always easy, but it is something that is necessary. So, and with that, guys, that is the end of chapter 5. If anybody has any questions,